to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. This is episode number 677. My name is CAMDEN BUCEY. I'm here in Grayslake, Illinois, and delighted to be back with everyone today for a fun conversation on Reformed theology, looking at some important topics, namely the covenant of works and its historical context and historical development. But let me introduce to you today first, we have one of our panelists, GLEN CLARY, who serves as the pastor of Providence OPC in Pflugerville, Texas. Welcome back, Glenn. So good to see you today.
It's good to see you too, Camden.
Yeah, it's been a little while since you've been on the program. Various topics have fallen out and schedules have been different and haven't matched up. So I'm glad to have you here today and looking forward to your input on the subject. We also have with us for the very first time, welcoming to the program, Harrison Perkins, who is a pastor of London City Presbyterian Church in London. It's a congregation of the Free Church of Scotland. He also serves as a lecturer at Edinburgh Seminary, as well as a regular contributor to Modern Reformation. Welcome to the program, Harrison. It's good to see you too.
Great to be with you guys. Really excited.
Yes, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. I know we're a little bit on other sides of the day, and so being about a little after 10 a.m. for Glenn and I in the central time zone of the U.S., you're in the late evening, afternoon. Looking forward to dinner, no doubt, so we won't try to keep you too long, although we could talk for many hours, no doubt. Today we're going to be speaking about the covenant of works, as I mentioned, but looking more specifically at its historical context and development through the lens of James Ussher. We have here the book that we're focusing on today, Catholicity and the Covenant of Works, James Ussher and the Reformed Tradition, by our guest today, Harrison Perkins. It's published by Oxford University Press, and it's a tremendous book, very thorough, roughly 260, 270 pages, if I recall, and just a wealth of information about the development of this important and critical doctrine here in the Reformed tradition, but also making the case that this isn't merely a Reformed doctrine, that it spans the traditional confessional Reformed boundaries and indeed is based upon and incorporates many Catholic aspects. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But Harrison, I'd like for just to open things up to you to speak a little bit about your interest in the subject. This is an extremely important field. Oddly enough, there haven't been as many historical treatments of the covenant of works as we might expect. But how were you introduced to the subject, not just the covenant of works in general, but specifically historical, theological investigation into this particular doctrine?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story in some ways. I'm a confessional Presbyterian minister, and so I have an interest in the Westminster Confession, obviously, of course, and as most of us have some sort of liking for the covenant theology in the Westminster Confession. When I was in seminary, really, I was doing research on the Assembly's covenant theology and trying to get a better idea of some of the historical backgrounds. Obviously, there are several discussions going on today within our circles about what the historical nature is, what the confessional position is, how many things are acceptable within that framework. And I was thinking through some of those issues. And the thing about it was, as I was reading about the Assembly and about covenant theology and its history, I kept seeing this name come up, James Ussher, and it's in a lot of the secondary literature, but kind of in passing. It's just asserted Ussher was fundamental for the Assembly's covenant theology, and I kept thinking, well, where are the articles and the books about Ussher's covenant theology, if this is such a thing? In God's providence, I got a copy of Ussher's Body of Divinity for my birthday.
Nice.
While I was in seminary, and so to make myself read through this, because it wasn't one of the assigned texts in seminary, so you sort of need extra motivation to get to the outside books just for time's sake. I decided to write a paper on Ussher's covenant theology for an elective course I was taking on the history of covenant theology with Scott Clark at Westminster, California. And so reading this, I kind of came up with a 17-page paper, kind of thing. And along the way, I emailed Crawford Gribben, who became my doctoral supervisor, and he had written a little bit on Ussher, and I was just asking him advice about sources. And he eventually said, "What would you be interested in turning this paper into a thesis?"
Wonderful.
And yeah,
it's always nice to get an invitation, because sometimes we end up with people that maybe shouldn't go on to extra work, but they persist, and they end up doing some projects that are maybe misguided. When you get an esteemed scholar inviting you to do this work, that's like the best scenario.
Well, yeah, and he's clearly interested in it. He's going to be invested.
Of course.
And he was great. So that was sort of the origins of that, was looking into my own traditions, kind of background for covenant theology, realizing apparently Ussher is really important for that, and yet nobody's talking about it. There's not this book, so might as well try to write it, and here it is. So that's sort of the kind of development of the idea. When I first started the project, the initial idea of going from 17 pages to 80,000 words was Ussher's. Yeah. There's a little bit of a difference between the two, and so you got to jump up the word count slightly. The initial thought I had was Ussher's covenant theology just holistically. Look at what he said about, particularly covenant of works and covenant of grace. His ministry was early in the period when the covenant of redemption was developing, and so in some ways, although it's not incompatible, it's not present in his theology. So I was going to do basically what lots of people have done for other figures. Here's an overview of his covenant theology. I ended up with about 40,000 words on the covenant of works, and that was originally intended to be one chapter. And I thought, right, okay, that's a sizable chapter. Maybe people would rather have a break in the middle of that. And so really, one of the reasons why I think it's probably right, I think it's right, but probably succeeds as an argument, is because it's not the argument I first set out to make. It's an argument that rose out of the sources as I kept seeing Ussher work over and work over and work over the covenant of works in his preaching and in his teaching. And clearly it's not the central idea, it's not the overriding category for him, but it is an important one, and he makes a lot of use of it, and he draws a lot of connections between it and other doctrines. And so it does play a paradigmatic role, along with covenant theology in general, for the way that he thinks about things, and particularly the way that he addresses God's people, which is interesting. That he thinks this is not just a theoretical framework, but something that is really useful for preaching. Yeah. That's kind of how the project developed and turned into the book that it is now. We can dive into specifics. Maybe sure. There's a particular way you want to go first. But.
Well, first off, I'm glad to see. I don't even know if it's a resurgence, but definitely the current interest in the subject, specifically from an historical theological perspective. I definitely want to draw our listeners' and viewers' attention to John Fesco's recent work as well, which is also published by Oxford University Press, The Covenant of Works, The Origins, Development, and Reception of the Doctrine. I hope maybe I can get a hold of Dr. Fesco and we can talk about that at some point. But there's great interest there. And you obviously are citing and working with Dr. Fesco's scholarship on and off throughout the book, along with in conversation with many scholars. So that's important, and the fact that this doctrine is getting further attention from this historical perspective is it's helping us to see, I think, along with all of the work done with the Westminster Assembly Project and the minutes of the Assembly and the new critical edition of the text of the Westminster Confession of Faith by Dr. John Bauer. It's helping us understand really the foundations and the historical context of these doctrines in the first place. So I think all of this is good for confessional Presbyterians. It's encouraging, strengthening. I think it should bolster our faith, but also our efforts in ministry. So I'm happy for that. But specifically speaking about Ussher, I'm curious if you could introduce many of our listeners to James Ussher and speak a little bit about his biography so that we can set the stage for the development of this doctrine. I think knowing who Ussher was, what his historical context was, is certainly going to help us understand how the doctrine more or less started to take shape, at least into the present form that we know it confessionally.
Sure. James Ussher, so perhaps still to today, is the leading or most known theologian of the Church of Ireland. So the established church, equivalent of the Church of England, but in Ireland. So he was born in 1581 in a fairly well-known, reputable family in Dublin. He became one of the first students to enroll at the new Trinity College, Dublin, which is still with us today and kind of the most prestigious university in Ireland. So he was one of the first students. It was there for a training university for ministers, and that was really going to be the direction he took from the beginning. In some ways, he kind of skyrocketed through the academic trajectory. He took all of his degrees at Trinity, became a fellow in the early 1600s, started working in churches in Dublin and kind of keeping, in some ways, a foot in the churchly world and in the academic world, producing a lot of stuff. That we don't know as many details or have as many records until about 1621, when he became the Bishop of Meath. So he had to leave the academy, step into one of these administrative churchly roles in some ways. 1625, one of the last things that James I did before he died was appoint James Ussher as the Archbishop of Armagh, which is the highest see in the Church of Ireland. So it's the sort of parallel position to the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Church of England. So he becomes the leading figure in the Church of Ireland, and Ussher is fairly thoroughly reformed. Now, he's not Presbyterian, as a lot of our readers are going to be. He is an Anglican, and was an Anglican. Now he's a Presbyterian, right? But so he was an Anglican. There are many sort of notes of Anglicanism that we find in his theology, but he was reformed. And in the Irish context, the Reformation takes on a really interesting character in Ireland. In essence, scholars debate why it was doomed to fail, or at least when it became doomed to fail. And some say it was always doomed to fail. Some say, well, it pretty quickly became doomed to fail. And some say, well, it took a little while, but yeah, it was essentially a non-event. But regardless of when you want to place that in conversation with the literature on the Irish Reformation, the point nonetheless is that the cultural context is predominantly Roman Catholic. And in contrast to what you see in a lot of continental situations, where it's sort of a populist movement and appealing to the magistrates for reformation. In Ireland, the foreign magistrates essentially are bringing Protestantism, and the Irish population is less than thrilled about it, partly because it is intertwined with politics. It's, at least as we analyze it looking back, it's easy to see that they're imagining Protestantism bound up with English governance. And so it's not welcomed because it's imposed. Now, there's various things to cash out about that, but except the point that's relevant for Ussher is, as a church authority, he has a very unique situation in that he is working for the furthering of Reformed Protestantism in a predominantly Roman Catholic country, but at the same time, it is the population that's against him, and so he is essentially, in some ways, and I think it's undeniable that at least in some ways he is working to bring an imposition of Protestantism and convince people of the truths of Protestantism, by we associate probably too much with the word coercion, but it's a little bit of that. I don't mean physical violence, anything like that. It's not hostile in the same way we think of coercion, but certainly he thought they should be made to go to Protestant services and fined essentially if they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's not the same approach I would take or or promote, but that's what he did, and that's
Right.
kind of the cultural situation. Now certainly there are reasons why he would be a bit angsty about that situation. There are also reasons. So Ussher was the primary author, I've argued, and I think that there will be a publication soon demonstrating this, that Ussher was the primary author of the Irish Articles, which was the first Protestant confession to do two things: name the covenant of works, which is the focus of the book, but also to call in a confession the Pope the Antichrist, which makes sense in the Irish context. This little group of Protestants essentially sees themselves fighting the eschatological battle for the souls of the
Sure.
world around them, and the Pope is coming after them as the Antichrist. So there's a historical reason for that. I also think, as sort of becomes, as I tried to argue in the book, there's a historical reason in that context why the covenant of works becomes so important for Ussher in his theology. The legal dimension of covenant theology has obvious relevance for refuting Roman theology. So there's that aspect of it from the beginning, and then there's also the fact that this makes our standing with God legal. But then there's also an anthropology that comes with it. You've asked for a biography, though. Sorry.
No worries.
Eventually, Ussher works from 1625 to 1640 in the Church of Ireland. The Laudian party is growing in the Church of England, which has I think, the most acceptable way to put it, that won't get a lot of pushback, is there is an added ceremonialism that comes with Laudianism. I would argue it's more than that, but that's probably the most acceptable way to put it as a baseline. Ussher doesn't like that aspect of it. He is a conformist, meaning that he accepts what the established church has written down as canon law, and he abides by these practices that are indifferent. I mean, I think we would say that most of these things are indifferent, at least, but his authorities have decided. So Ussher, as a conservative, goes with what his authorities have decided on indifferent matters. We may now think that they're not as indifferent, but probably in some ways we think they're not indifferent because people have tried to tell us what to do, whereas he's in a slightly different situation. In 1640, Ussher goes to England on church business. He made these visits regularly for research and building relationships and networking. The Irish Rebellion breaks out in 1641, which prevents him from returning. Essentially, if he went back, the Roman Catholic party that had taken control now would kill him. And by the time that had settled down, essentially, he was too unwell to return. So he finished his career in England. He lectured for a while. He preached as a lecturer in London for about a year at St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden. And then when the Civil War broke out, he went to join Charles I. He was a royalist politically, so he went to Oxford, where the royalist camp had set up base. And from there, we have some sermons recorded, and we also have student notes of lectures that he gave on Reformed theology in Oxford, 1643 to 44, which is, as we know, when the assembly is getting going and ramping up. So these sermons and these lectures are interesting in their timing and certainly what they talk about, and especially because of where they were. They are thoroughly Reformed, and Charles is right down the road with anti-parliamentarian and at least somewhat anti-Reformed position on his part. Ussher left when essentially the parliamentarians were gaining the upper ground, Ussher left Oxford, ended up back in London, and he preached the rest of his career at Lincoln's Inn in London. And from those two London pulpits, we have a huge body of manuscript sermons, which is really fascinating material. Almost 10 years of sermon material from London that auditors wrote down, and he preached through the topics of systematic theology. Interestingly, he didn't work through books of the Bible. He preached topically through the body of divinity, as he would have called it. He died in 1656 under the interregnum. Oliver Cromwell suspended the ban on the Book of Common Prayer so that they could use its liturgy for Ussher's funeral.
No kidding.
Oh, wow. Which is a tip of the hat, if it's anything. And Ussher was buried in Westminster Abbey, where he still is today.
Wow.
So that's that's an overview of his life and career, some of the high points and that. He's an interesting figure for historical research because he was a historical theologian. A lot of his publications were historical in nature, and that gives you kind of a fascinating window on what Reformed people were doing with doctrine to shape it in light of history.
Thank you very much, Harrison. That is quite fascinating. And I've got a question about his biography. I wonder if you can fill out maybe more specifically Ussher's relation to the English Puritans. And you mentioned some of the influences on Ussher, Cartwright, for example. And then you mentioned the Irish Articles and how that would influence the Westminster Assembly. But maybe you can explain a little more for our listeners his relationship to the Puritans. You know, is it right to call him a Puritan or not, an Irish Puritan or whatever? And how can one be a conformist and a Puritan? Is it a doctrinal matter, or is it a matter of canon law and so on?
Yeah, it's a nuanced answer to that question. We have a difficulty today with the word Puritan. There's a sense where, I mean, probably more well known, we have a difficulty with the word evangelical, right? You know, the three of us are confessional. Are we evangelicals? It depends on which one of us you ask and how good we feel on the day,
exactly.
I suppose. And we have a similar problem with understanding the word Puritan. Who is a Puritan? Well, if you know, in one degree, we can take a sort of probably really well-known example of John Owen and Richard Baxter. They're both called Puritans by some people, at least, and yet they're debating each other about doctrines of soteriology. So if people can disagree on, you know, kind of how we explain the gospel and yet be in the same category, that's an interesting category that we have. And then you add someone else. So John Milton, whom we know now was an anti-Trinitarian, and yet he was a Puritan also. This is a very interesting category that we've developed. And how can we explain it a little bit better, perhaps? The way that I come at this is I think we need a historical guideline rather than just guesswork. And so, you know, in the same way that we would, you know, understand ourselves as Reformed in light of the Reformed confessions, these statements that the church made, and these are kind of official and historical pinpoints about Reformed identity. Well, we need something similar in regard to the word Puritan. And what I've suggested is that this relates to canon law, which, you know, in some ways, probably the best analogy, although it'll be a controversial analogy, and I don't mean to over-assert the illustration, but it's similar to a book of church order, right? We have this book that helps us navigate some of the practical decisions that we use in conducting, you know, affairs of ministry, how we do this, how we do that, how many people we need for various activities, and so on and so forth. And canon law answers some. It's not a doctrinal confession in the same way that the confessions are, but it lands on some of these practical issues. So it's going to require the preacher to wear a surplice. It's going to at least make a pointed defense of using the sign of the cross at baptism, something that is perhaps less indifferent than what we wear in the pulpit. Um, Things like that, though, and answering some of those questions. So, it, canon law, if we read it, and if we read some of the first sort of really heated issues in what we call today Puritanism, it's these issues in canon law. I think by and large, it's not going to exhaustively explain that. But so I think that there's a way that we can start to use these historical documents, what the established church decided about various matters and imposed as a category of, okay, the Puritans in England didn't like a lot of canon law, and they thought it overstepped what was indifferent, and they didn't, and at least they didn't like that it made decisions and imposed things about what is indifferent. And so, in that regard, perhaps we may have to revise some people whom we've thought were Puritans. William Perkins, for example, I mean, although in many ways taught uh, many of the people who rightfully, according to this historical understanding, still would be called Puritans, was a conformist. He doesn't seem to reject, established church procedures, canon law, and that kind of thing. Although canon law isn't the exact criteria for him because it was introduced essentially after he died. But he didn't buck against what was handed down from the centralized church authorities. In that regard, while Ussher's drawing on Perkins, Ussher, who's a conformist, but Ussher's also drawing on Thomas Cartwright, who was a Cambridge Presbyterian. And yeah, there's a lot of ways that we can just outright understand him as a Puritan, and we don't have to qualify that much. He wanted to purify the church of things that had been introduced and were stated in canon law. So, in that regard, Ussher is not an English Puritan, certainly, because he accepts the things that, by and large, it seems that he accepts the things that are stated in English canon law. He requires the surplice when people are preaching, various things along the way. That's probably one of the obvious examples that has a crystal clear debate tied to it about vestments. But the placement of the communion table, for example, is a counter example. He doesn't go with the ceremonialists, the Laudians, in that he's happy to accept what canon law says to do. But when William Laud hands down the injunction to place the communion tables altar-wise in the east end of the churches, like the altar, quotation marks altar, under like it was under Roman jurisdiction. Well, that's not in canon law, and Ussher says, "Thanks for that. We'll get to it," and never does it. So that's a sort of counterexample where he's not going to go with what they say about anything. It's these indifferent matters that they've just kind of made a decision. Now, if we come to the Irish context, we get some sort of further nuances to that. I've argued Ussher is certainly not an English Puritanism, but there's perhaps a case to make that he was an Irish Puritan. Because actually it seems that he is ready to use the features of the established church, which includes canon law, to help further the Reformation in the church. So whereas the English Puritans thought that they needed to overcome canon law and procedures of the established church to further the Reformation, Ussher was very ready to draw on those formal resources to further the Reformation. So I think that perhaps, there's a case to be made that Irish Puritanism was more official, jurisdictional, and administrative in that regard. And because the goal was still purify the church. In this case, purify it from ministers who hadn't come all the way into the Reformed faith. And certainly the laity as well, who were even further away from holistically having embraced the Reformed faith. So Ussher, I think, occupies an interesting middle role in how we explain and understand Puritanism, and even in how we, define him. In one way, he faces in a direction where he's very ready to say, "I'm not a Puritan," when he's being interviewed about becoming the Archbishop, he's very ready to tell James I, I'm not a Puritan, which is something we have to keep in mind, and shouldn't just lump him into English Puritanism, even though he's thoroughly reformed.
And he does not attend the Westminster Assembly, too.
Well, he didn't attend, but he was a member, so he was a non-attending member over royalist politics.
Right.
He's, as far as I know, he was the only one to be invited twice, actually, which makes him a fascinating character too. So he holds a mixed role in Puritanism, and I think there's nuanced ways we need to understand him in that regard.
Right.
He was reformed, and we can come down pretty clear on that. He was a reformed conformist,
Right.
an Anglican, and yet agrees with us fairly thoroughly, as far as I can tell, on what today we would consider the more strictly theological issues.
Right. So, theologically speaking, Ussher and the English Puritans are on the same page.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the Westminster Assembly, literally they were on the same page, his page, his Irish articles.
Well, so that's I have an essay actually in Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology about Ussher's relationship to the Assembly, and I think there's a strong case to be made. I mean, considering he was a non-attending member, and they relied heavily on the Irish articles, which has been, suggested and to some degree demonstrated previously. But there's interesting so his body of divinity is also likely a source that they used, which is fascinating because actually the Assembly, to his disapproval, to some, it's not the Assembly outright, but people involved with the Assembly published Ussher's body of divinity, and he wasn't thrilled about that. But the fact that they wanted it in print is something of a statement. And then there's actually these sermons from the 1640s that he preached in Oxford, which this is sort of discussed in the book some, and in the article too. As you both will know, these early assembly debates were about justification and imputation of active obedience, which has been discussed at length in various articles and chapters, and a lot of this centered around Thomas Gattaker and his view denying active obedience being imputed. And Ussher's preaching this series of 18 sermons, essentially on soteriology, but he starts, at the beginning, you need to repent. He works through, our sin and misery under the law. He's talking about regeneration. And then he gets to justification. And he preaches about justification often. So in some ways, there's not a particularly distinct thing in the act that he would talk about it. But then he takes what I think is at least an extra technical excursus in one of these sermons compared to the rest of them, at least. And for the pulpit, he gets right into the weeds, going after this issue of active obedience. And considering, I think the best dating for these sermons is 1643, basically. And people had been in contact with him. I mean, Daniel Featley was put in jail because he was sending letters to Ussher from the Assembly about imputation. And then Ussher takes this deep dive from the pulpit about imputation of active obedience. You're reading between the lines. I think it's very plausible, if not most likely, that Ussher is taking his jab at the Assembly debates and making an indirect address, contribution, however you would like to put it. I think the original way I put it was indirect contribution, and Chad Van Dixhoorn thought that I should rephrase that because he didn't actually contribute it. So I defer to Chad on all things Assembly, and if he thinks it's an indirect address, then so do I.
Well, I very much appreciate the fact that you rely heavily not only on the theological treatises written by Ussher, but also his sermons. And I think the homiletical corpus of some theologians is often neglected in the study of their theology. I'm glad you did not do that. I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect. I mean, Ussher was a preacher, and with all the other things that he was, and then we can call him. He was a magnificent historian. I mean, especially given the resources that he had. His output was prolific and immense, and his work on the Ignatian epistles still essentially holds up 400 years later. He was also a gifted theologian, and yet he's a preacher. At the end of the day, he's preaching God's word to people who need the gospel. And I think one of the fascinating things about it is he's not pulling theological punches. I mean, granted, his audience is going to be university audiences, or at least, educated, university trained audiences when he's back in London at Lincoln's Inn. There's a lot of solicitors, lawyers, as we call them. But still, these are not lightweight things that he's talking about. He's going through systematic theology, talking about the Trinity, talking about covenant theology, lots and lots of things that even I sort of think, okay, is that too technical? Can I take that into the pulpit? I hope eventually we can work up to that, but in the same compressed way that he did, it would probably be hard. And that shows us that, I mean, he really thought this stuff that he's doing is really valuable for God's people. And the fact that I can dig up so much stuff on the covenant of works, which I think a lot of people think is like, oh, that's interesting, but it's kind of arcane and at least theoretical for over there. And yet he's I mean, just grinding it out in the pulpit, pretty continuously. Maybe there's something to say to us there.
I think so. I think that it's a helpful reminder that the covenant of works is dealing directly with the gospel itself. I mean, we're not just merely talking about, as you allude to, arcane issues or things that only scholars need to be dealing with, but the very subject matter is, what's the problem? It's our sin, and how do we escape the wrath of God? It's through Jesus Christ, ultimately, and his satisfaction. So, I mean, that's the implications of that are tremendous. But what's interesting is when we speak often about the covenant of works, some people obviously know that it's a Reformed doctrine, but might think that it was invented entirely somehow by Reformed theologians, and it's just an imposition on Scripture. It's something that's constructed by scholastics or something and just added to the text. But one of the major themes of your book, obviously in light of its title even, Catholicity and the Covenant of Works, is that Ussher is even though he's living in tumultuous times and dealing with the Reformation and the development of these doctrines at the time and all the ecclesiastical matters, he's still working with, in many cases, ancient sources. I was wondering if you could open the door for us a little bit, help us understand some of the traditional teachings that he appropriated even from ancient and medieval sources in developing what we know today as the covenant of works, the doctrine of the covenant of works.
Yes, certainly. And that's, I guess, as a preface and side note, I hope that this is one of the valuable things that this book can do for the church. I mean, that's up to others to decide. But at the same time, I'm really hoping that the church will find this useful in reminding us that Reformed people aren't really innovative, that we, perhaps we have new terms that we've put on categories, and that's true, and I don't think that's a problem. But we're working within a very traditional, we're Reformed Catholics, right? As William Perkins put it, as people are more and more liking to put it today. And there is a Catholicity and ecumenical nature to Reformed assumptions. We might have a new apparatus for it, but we shouldn't think that we've got to reinvent the wheel. There are some things that are distinctively Reformed. We maybe shouldn't seek after as many distinctively Reformed things as we have at times.
Sure.
And sometimes that's gotten us into trouble. That's a different conversation. But so one of the things, after deciding that, okay, I'm going to focus this whole thesis on the covenant of works, I kind of really wanted to do two things. One, Richard Muller is obviously, the unsurpassable name in Reformed historical theology, but every dissertation records everything that Richard Muller has said, and kind of gives a synopsis of his career in some ways. And I wanted to make the self-conscious decision. What if I start with the premise that actually Muller doesn't need my help in making his point? He's succeeded, and I'm too much of a dwarf to come along and think I'm making anything extra to his point. So what if I just assume that as the starting point? There's continuity between earlier stages of Christian tradition and what Reformed people are doing. Take that for granted and let's move ahead. Okay, well, the second thing then becomes, if I'm looking at the covenant of works, how do I pull the lid off this doctrine and look under the hood, uh, perhaps in more depth than I've seen it considered in print, at least, than before, and really try to give an idea of the inner workings of how this came together and why it would be a natural conclusion for Reformed Christians to reach. And there's a couple of things. I mean, within in the context of the early Reformation, well, covenant as a category is becoming more and more used in our theology anyway. So there's that. There's the linguistic aspect within the Reformation. But if we look further past that, well, Christians have always had a notion of nature. Creation is important to us. We still talk about creation, fall, redemption, and Christians have talked about that in various terms always. And that means the doctrine of creation is important in our tradition. Well, the law, in various ways, is also important. And since the early church, and increasingly so in the medieval church, this notion of a natural law was important. That God didn't make up the Ten Commandments when He revealed them at Sinai, but as our confession says, the law that He gave to Adam was handed down to Moses atop Mount Sinai. So this moral law, the natural law that Adam had as a creature meant to represent God as His image. The law summarizes God's character. Adam as God's image is meant to reflect that character, and so by nature, inescapably, He knows the law, the moral law. And that's revealed again at Mount Sinai. And Tertullian is talking about this in the ancient church. It's bouncing around in other ways. Thomas Aquinas does a lot with this. There's more in the book about Thomas than I originally expected. I thought it would be a fascinating little side point here and there at times, but this was years ago when I was doing this. And then it kind of just blew up, and I thought, well, I've actually got to do something with it, and say there's a fascinating aspect in that, though, when we think about Thomas on natural law, to see how the Reformed are using him and how they're using the medieval tradition in regard to natural law. Well, Thomas thinks basically not exactly, but essentially what I just said, that God's character is summarized in the moral law, and that's why it's immutable and it's given to us in the natural law. When you set that against it, now we may not like everything that Thomas said, and that's fair and reasonable, 100%. But one of the things I try to do is, well, if you look at him next to the other medieval figures, I did it on natural law, and you have some of them saying, well, the natural law is actually non-existent. God could command someone to hate God, and they should just do that. That would then be right. Or a more moderate, so that would be kind of the Occamist view, a hard voluntarism. And then you've got like a Franciscan category of natural law, which kind of says, well, the first two commandments, under the Roman, what we would consider now the Roman ordering of the commandments, well, those are natural and sort of immutable, but the rest, are up for grabs. Well, in that context, in the medieval options, as the Reformed are looking at the medieval options for natural law, I think, well, Thomas seems like the obvious preference. Doesn't mean you have to go with him all the way, but it's kind of like, well, of those, I like that the most. And so you have a sort of Thomistic or an appropriation of Thomistic natural law that Ussher uses, that harks back to the ancient church. Well, and then you've got this idea of Adam's headship, which Christians who believe in a doctrine of original sin, which is basically everyone except Pelagius, with whom we disagree, you know, everyone who believes in original sin has some version of Adam's headship. And now, whether that's sort of more forensic and legal as it becomes in the covenant of works, or if it's more, however you want to parse it out, otherwise biological or natural or genetic, is sort of aside from the point that they believe in Adam's headship. Well, then we get to Ussher and the doctrine of the covenant of works. So you've got a growing use of the covenantal category. You've got he is a researcher of the patristic tradition, and ready to draw on that and the best of the medievals to bring together natural law and then Adam's headship and bring that to bear for Protestant soteriology. You've kind of got a ball of yarn that gives us the covenant of works out of a lot of really ecumenical and traditional premises. These things that are trailing into the covenant of works are perhaps repackaged under this label, but it's a set of binding them together under a category is not an innovative move. It's really just tying threads together of the ecumenical tradition. And I think that that's really what Ussher has done in his context. I mean, and that's a comment on really what we did as the Reformed tradition. Perhaps Ussher did it very visibly because we can see him as an individual working over these historical ideas. But I think that's essentially what happened in our tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like what you're saying here, and also what you've presented in the book, is that if you're looking for the historical antecedents of the doctrine of the covenant of works and looking for points of continuity in the doctrine of the covenant of works as expressed in Reformed theology, you want to look at three things in particular in the ancient and medieval church. Adam's headship, which you can find expressed very clearly, for example, in the Augustinian doctrine of original sin. And you would want to look at the doctrine of natural law, expressed clearly in the writings of Thomas, and also the intellectualism in the tradition of Thomas.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Those are the 3 points of continuity you would search.
Those are, and especially the first two. I think there is a little bit of variation within our tradition on the intellectualist point.
Okay.
But yes, in regard to Ussher, those three things are significant points of continuity.
Right.
That the ecumenical tradition just sort of falls in his lap in some ways.
Got it. So you would say, and I think you do say this in your book, as I recall, that you would find Reformed theologians who hold to a covenant of works that are voluntarist. And so that third category of the intellectualism is not a necessary antecedent, though it is in Ussher's writings.
Yeah, I think that he is a pretty firmly planted intellectualist philosophically. There are other formulations where it's eclectic, right? I'll get tagged by historians if I say he's just outright. It is eclectic, certainly, and especially I think the voluntarists are probably a bit more eclectic too. But you see a little bit of voluntarism on the law in William Perkins, for example. And so they do construct this a little bit differently. And yet, Adam's headship and the law become really important, especially in the final product of the covenant of works.
Mm-hmm. There are obviously Catholic trends, and we see here Ussher working with much that came before him, but we also see how he develops and advances the doctrine even as it's formulated. And one of those areas is in Adam's federal headship. And you referenced the difference that we might have either between like a biological or a realist or a genealogical view of how Adam represents all those who come after him. And then we have, what Ussher introduced, seemingly a more legal understanding and framework. This is something that, as far as I read it, it seems like the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms kind of allows a variety of understandings within there. And when I taught Doctrine of Man down at the Mid-America Reformed Seminary, I always try to make that point and try to emphasize that maybe a purely biological view isn't the best way to think about things. Just the only reason that Adam represents humanity is because we descend from him, physically. That leads to a problem with, I don't know, Jesus Christ maybe having a sin and being
that
under the just that small issue. But I'd love for you to expand on this and speak a bit about the development of the covenant of works and Ussher's particular contribution here on the nature of Adam's representation.
Yeah, it is certainly. I mean, our confessional documents, as you say, I think they have some flexibility to allow for some diversity of understanding. There are some things that we have to affirm, and then there's a little bit of room for understanding it a little bit differently. I do think that Ussher sort of brings to the table a distinct emphasis on the legal aspect of Adam's representative role for the human race. That isn't to deny that he sees, the kind of biological or natural connection. He does, and he links that to the notion of corruption. But in terms of guilt, he keeps a very consistent and tight distinction throughout his preaching ministry, in particular, which is really interesting, between imputation, so imputed righteousness or imputed guilt, and inherent righteousness or imputed guilt. Yeah. So imputation, imputed or inherent righteousness or guilt. And I think that he is really ready to talk more at length than some others about the representative dimension. So when he is talking about Adam's role and how he could have become justified in the covenant of works, he's seen Adam doing this as a public figure, as he calls it. He wasn't just a private figure, but a public figure. And in Ussher's theology, there's only two public figures, Adam and Jesus Christ. And so one of the dimensions, which no doubt he's getting because he's orthodox on Christology and the work of Christ for us, he wants to heighten the parallel, or at least tighten up the parallel to make sure it's consistent, that what Adam's doing for us would have been imputed as well as inherited. So without denying the inheritance aspect, Adam's guilt was imputed. Adam's righteousness could have been imputed if he had succeeded in the probationary test. And I think that he is thorough on that point, which marks, I don't want to say that Ussher was sort of the most original in coming up with these ideas. But he certainly marks a point of transition when this becomes more thoroughly implemented in the Reformed tradition. And I think we can easily pinpoint it to him in specifics because he's the primary author at least, of the Irish Articles. So if this confession is for the first time bringing an explicitly and overtly covenantal dimension with its legal features to Adam's role, and Ussher stands behind this. Ussher is kind of the tipping point for when we start talking more prolifically and profoundly, which means perhaps more consistently in those ways. And I think that cashes out if you look at his sermon manuscripts. I think he's one of the clearer people on always balancing the back and forth of imputed versus inherent. And he preaches for a few years on sanctification, and it's an interesting set of sermons. And one of the key things that he's pushing is that imputed versus inherent theme. And as he's talking about sanctification, well, you're under for us, like we realize we're under that category, that point of inherent, and we're hoping that we're putting to death more and more the inherent sinfulness and growing more and more by the grace of the Holy Spirit in the inherent righteousness. And so in that regard, I mean, he knows that, and he knows that's what sanctification is about. And yet at the same time, he also knows, well, my hearers are probably not going to remember this distinction as well as trained theologians. And so he's banging on and on and on pretty frequently of, remember that I already talked to you about imputed righteousness.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about inherent righteousness. And these are different.
Yeah. It's interesting to see his homiletical strategy at work, and the ways in which he preached on this and even talked about things such as the role of human works. Even larger than that, I'm curious for you to speak to, I guess, the nature of representation here, and more specifically, the doctrine of predestination as Ussher understood it. Because there's some differences in terms of universality and specific, particular redemption, those sorts of things. Those are some interesting themes where we see some particular, emphases within Ussher that I think people would be interested to hear.
Ussher was what now we call a hypothetical universalist.
Mm-hmm.
So he saw Christ's death as having a hypothetical value for all humankind. So whereas most of us, I'm assuming, we're particularists in that we believe that Christ died for only the elect and paid for their sins only.
Mm-hmm.
Ussher believed that there was a hypothetical sense in which Christ paid for the sins of all humanity, rendering humanity forgivable. So there's a few things to tease out in light of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the first is about predestination, because especially as we get later to John Cameron and to Amiro, we see that the decrees do get played with. And there is a different order of decrees, particularly in Amiro, than what we tend to hold to. And so does it mean that hypothetical universalists in totality diluted the doctrine of predestination and made election dependent upon something in the creature at all, which would be an Arminian moving direction if that were the case? Well, Ussher clearly has a thorough doctrine of predestination where God. So Ussher believed that God has chosen the elect, and I've argued. I know that some people aren't going to see it the same way, but I've argued that Ussher was a supralapsarian. So God, the order of the decrees in Ussher's mind then was, well, at least in terms of election particularly, he doesn't get into the specifics of creation. So like the creatable dynamic there, I think we just can't comment. But I think that Ussher decrees election and reprobation sees the decree of election and reprobation prior to the fall. And the fall is brought about so that people would fall in sin, which is basically a quote from one of his manuscripts. And so, which is interesting, because if we're talking about the doctrine of predestination, when we think about the supralapsarians, most people don't think they have a diluted version of predestination. Yeah, they tend to stick out as, they're pretty rigorous.
Absolutely. Hardcore.
And if Ussher is the supralapsarian, and a hypothetical universalist. Well, then it means that not all of hypothetical universalism does not require diluting the doctrine of predestination. It does not mean that you have essentially moved in an Arminian direction.
I think it's interesting to note that people might not realize necessarily kind of the current debates that are going on even within the theology of the Westminster Standards. This is all bound up with current discussions, because there's two questions really: whether anyone agrees with the hypothetical universalist doctrine itself. There's a debate of whether the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms would allow it. And there were people that held to that view at the assembly. The question is whether the standards themselves, precluded them from holding to that in the future. So that's one issue at stake. But it's interesting just to hear how Ussher fits into that whole milieu and the dynamic of the time.
Yeah, I think he's a paradigm breaker in that regard. That he holds things that we would in some way. I went into it assuming that you can't be both of those.
Yeah.
You and he hasn't drawn all the connections. I admit in the book he does not address the lapsarian question, but if we infer from the statements he made, we can come to an approximate suggestion that I think he was super on.
So Harrison,
in that regard, right? At least now, some of the hypothetical universalists, and depending on the version, I think did move in Arminian direction. But Ussher shows that you apparently don't have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now that is just an issue about the decrees. Can you be orthodox on the decrees and fit within, the Westminster Confession, essentially? Well, yeah, it seems you can. That doesn't address the specific issue of the extent of Christ's satisfaction. Now, I think one of the things that's going on here is, well, there's two. One of them is historical, and one of them is intrinsic to Ussher's theology. Historically, Ussher is doing most of his formulation of his ideas prior to when the covenant of redemption is going to become widespread. So John Fesco, his work has dated the first sort of explicit use of the covenant of redemption, 1638, and in the Scottish General Assembly address by David Dixon. And it pretty rapidly becomes a well-used category in Reformed theology. And certainly it has resonances before that, and is in the same way the covenant of works is a packaging and labeling of something. It's the same, I think. But the full formulation of it comes relatively near to the end of Ussher's career. I mean, he's going to be in his 50s when that's coming into predominance. And he's probably already just, decided most of his positions by that point, and not ready to reformulate things a lot. So in the covenant of redemption, you have the covenantal mechanism to limit the extent of Christ's satisfaction. But historically, Ussher doesn't have that resource. So that's one aspect to this. On the other hand, within Ussher's own theology, the covenant of works, it plays a huge role as, if I was able to get a whole book out of it, like he says a lot about it. And one of the things going on there is that means that a lot of Ussher's theology is grounded in nature, not in the sense of lacking special revelation. That's not the point at all. But in the sense that considering the way that God made the world and the way that he made this covenant with Adam, that affects the way that Ussher thinks about a lot of things. And God made this covenant with Adam by nature that included all of humanity. And so when you get to Ussher's Christology, well, he makes a significant, so this is one of the other kind of ecumenical themes, is the doctrine of recapitulation, where Christ going back to Irenaeus and some echoes of it in Anselm, Christ is rehashing the Adamic task, which we're seeing more and more in biblical theology too. I mean, big studies are coming out on the last Adam theology, and that's a big deal for Ussher. And if you lack historically, if you lack this covenant of redemption to shrink whom Christ represents, and he is the last Adam, rehashing the covenant of works task. Well, there's kind of an embedded idea that this is going to have some sort of universal aspect, until you get that limiting mechanism, which he doesn't have. So I think the fact that he prioritizes the covenant of works so much is in one way what pushes him into this hypothetical universalism, because he does change his mind about it. Early on, he held to a particular position. As Richard Snoddy has demonstrated, he changed his mind sort of relatively recently before the Synod of Dort. And if you're working with the covenant of works, a natural category, in terms of that it relates to nature and all of nature as such, well, that's going to be where his Christology kind of drifts if he's integrated and consistent throughout it.
I'm curious to know how closely he followed the theological controversies going on in the Netherlands with Arminius and Gomorrus and the Remonstrants and so on. And I would even be curious to know whether he changed his mind again after the Synod of Dort on this particular view.
So he did follow the debates in the Netherlands pretty thoroughly to some degree or other. I mean, he was in correspondence with the British delegation to the Synod of Dort. He was really good friends with Samuel Ward, who was one of the delegates. I mean, essentially career-long friends with Ward, and they are, hashing this issue out together about that. So Ussher has this famous letter addressing the extent of the atonement that was later published, and now we have it in the collected correspondence of Ussher. And this is the kind of the first extended place where he outlines this hypothetical universalism. And people have suggested, and I think it's reasonable, that it was at least used, if not meant for use, at the Synod of Dort. Jonathan Moore has an essay in the Brill volume. I think it's just called Revisiting the Synod of Dort or something like that, where the essay is like Ussher's contribution to the Synod of Dort. So it seems like he was a background figure. He at least had offered insights to the British delegation. And that's going to be his kind of method of input, so to speak. It's perhaps more restricted even than his contribution to the assembly and that kind of thing, but he knew what was going on there. There's another sense. So he wrote a book on Gottschalk, who was a medieval monk who got in trouble for arguing for double predestination, basically. And his view was condemned. Ussher writes a book about him to show the kind of Laudian and regime under Charles I, to show them, look, predestination is part of the Augustinian heritage. Double predestination in particular is part of our heritage. And here's Gottschalk. And look, people weren't very nice to Gottschalk, and you shouldn't be like the people who weren't very nice, was kind of the implicit point. But he dedicates this book, Defending Double Predestination, historically, to Vossius, who was at least suspected, if not verifiably, a Dutch Arminian. And so there's sort of he kind of writes the letters like, I've really appreciated your work, and, thanks for, writing on the Pelagian controversy. You might want to look at mine too. I think it, suggests some extra things. And you read letters to other people, it's like, yeah, Vossius was probably an Armenian or a Pelagian, and I hope he reads my book because it'll sort him out. So he certainly has a more proximate reason for writing in defense of predestination historically, but he also has in view addressing the situation in the Netherlands through it as well. So he does have his finger on the pulse of that kind of thing.
Very good. It's probably not a great polemical strategy, though, if you're going to show the historical roots of your doctrine, to pick someone who's been condemned over that.
Yeah. And he goes through a lot of effort to sort of vindicate him.
Right. I'm glad to see the Dutch connection, and it looks like it's not only was Ussher following the controversies in the Netherlands, he was seeking to influence it through the British delegation by sending a letter, apparently. But it also makes me wonder too, just to back up a little bit, in tracing the influences on Ussher himself, as far as his bicovenantal system, body of divinity is concerned. I wonder if Ursinus and Olivianus and their bicovenantalism, which at least is in one of their catechisms, the one that wasn't officially adopted, and I know Voss points this out in his chapter on the doctrine of the covenant of works, I wonder if that had any influence on Ussher.
Certainly. I mean, Ussher is one of these guys who didn't read just what he had to. I mean, he is, I think so when he died and his personal library was given to Trinity College Dublin, and it's still there actually, in the long room, the famous room, there's 2 alcoves that are his books. It was 10,000 books. So he was a reader, and he was in touch with all of these things. So certainly he definitely said, so in this year's edition of the Confessional Presbyterian Journal, it's on Ussher, or it focuses on Ussher. And I've contributed, one of the pieces I contributed was a transcription of Ussher's recommended reading, that he basically just named lists and lists of books and authors to divinity students at Oxford. And I mean, Ursinus is definitely on there. I mean, these guys that you're going to think of first are in this list. And so he knows about it. He's recommending it. He's definitely drawing on a continental tradition. The 2 guys that he names in that place as foremost, he says, read all of Perkins and all of Rollick. So William Perkins and Robert Rollick sort of take this, higher seat than all the other greats, as great as they might be. These 2 are the ones you just need to read everything. And there's some significant use of these federal motifs in both of those in different ways. I think that there are passing references, I think, later in Perkins's work about a covenant with Adam, but it doesn't come to the forefront. For him, the covenant of works seems to be Moses, or at least foremost associated with Moses is probably a more careful way to put that, which is interesting in a few different ways. Rollick, on the other hand, looks strikingly similar to pretty mature versions of the covenant of works in various ways. So those, I think, are the 2 guys we can demonstrate Ussher depended on the most, because he tells you that. And you can look at their theology and see. So one of the things I did at one point in the book was actually show where actually Ussher pretty much lifts and adopts 2 different portions of exegesis from Rollick's commentaries and William Perkins' commentaries, and basically rolls it together and produces sort of a synthesized version of both of their views. And it's, considering that he named these people, it's not guesswork, which is something I try to avoid. We do a lot of, well, that book is important, so it must have been important to everyone, but not necessarily. And especially given Ussher was, on a different island, there's the physical dimension of, well, it has to travel there, and did it travel there? He couldn't go to the PRDL and download it like we can. So finding those demonstrable links is really important in this case. And he names all of these guys. He names continental figures. But it seems like, I mean, particularly in this regard, we can sort of focus in on Perkins and Rollick as kind of fundamental, mentors of sorts. Not directly, he didn't know them as far as I can tell, but mentors of sorts through their writings.
I think definitely just in experiencing this very conversation, we see all the interesting threads that come out of Ussher. I mean, he's just at the middle of so much, theologically, historically, ecclesiastically, that, I feel like this is the first of many books to come, perhaps. And I also feel in many ways that this could be the first of many conversations to come. I even mentioned to you, Harrison, before we started, even via email, on how we might need to have a round 2 and a round 3, who knows, going forward to start to pull some of these threads. And I hope we can do that at some point. But heretofore, thanks so much.
I'm very excited to come back if you're willing to have me.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today. I do want to encourage people to check out the book. It's tremendous. It's fascinating, very interesting. And it's a subject well worth spending time on. And the book's title, of course, Catholicity and the Covenant of Works, James Ussher and the Reformed Tradition. Maybe we should have said up front, but if anyone's actually trying to search on Google or whatnot, there's 2 S's in Ussher. I don't know if that's going to make a difference, but if you're looking for James Ussher, Ussher, James Ussher and the Reformed Tradition, by our guest today, Harrison Perkins, published by Oxford University Press. We'll have links to everything in the episode description for following up after the fact. You can follow Harrison online. You follow him on Twitter, I believe, at HarrisonP87. Is that correct?
That's right.
Get some good tidbits there and follow up with what he's doing at Modern Ref and at the seminary there in Edinburgh. A lot of interesting stuff. So I do want to point people to our website as well, reformedforum.org, where you'll find information about all of our programs and online courses, publications and events, things going on there. And I do want to thank you for listening. We hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.